Back in front of my favorite stream again, talking about this book, the Qur'an. And we're going to be asking questions now. What exactly is the Qur'an? What does the word mean to begin with? Well, the word Qur'an comes from the word qara'a. Now, according to Islamic tradition, I don't believe this happened, but nonetheless, this is what the Muslims say, and this is their tradition, therefore they've got to follow it. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad would go and leave Mecca and meditate up in a cave called the Hira cave. So he went up to the Hira cave, and while he was there at one time, suddenly within the cave, a being appeared. The Muslims would say this is an angel. It was an angel, Jibril, or as we know, Gabriel. That Gabriel appeared to him and said, Iqra. Iqra means to read or recite. And his response was, Ma'akra, I cannot read or recite. And that's why Muslims believe he was illiterate, so he could not respond. And so the angel squeezed him and asked him a second time. He said he could not, and so it squeezed him a second time, asked him a third time. And this went on for 3 times, him responding, he cannot read, he cannot recite. And then the angel finally let him go, and he went back to Mecca, and he went to Khadija, his only wife at that time, and then told her the story. Now, that's the beginning of not the revelations yet, because that's not in the Quran itself. That comes from the traditions. But the word Iqra or qara'a. Iqra is imperative. You recite. That word qara'a then is where the word Qur'an, the recitation, comes from. But that's not the only word that is used. There are other references. Al-furqan, the distinction. Now that's interesting because it's a distinction between what? And when I've asked Muslims, what does this mean by distinction? They say, well, it's a distinction between that which came before. So it's a comparative. Now, so it's in some ways, it's like a polemic here. Another word is Al-mus'haf. That is the scroll. Now, technically, that's not really what the Quran. Anything could be the mus'haf. Anything could be a mus'haf. But the mus'haf, when it's Al-mus'haf, they're referring to the one and only, the Qur'an. So it wouldn't be so much this book that is the mus'haf, it would be the manuscripts that we've talked about in the external critique and that we'll be continuing later on. That's another name, the mus'haf. And usually when they say the mus'haf, that's we're referring to that. And then another word is Al-dhikr. Al-dhikr means the warning. In some ways, that's probably the most appropriate word for this book, because when you read the Quran, and I'm sure many of you have, when you take a look at what it says, it is warning after warning after warning. It is just that. It warns you about the pagans, it warns you about the idolaters, it warns you about the Christians, the Jews, you name it, it warns you. And in some ways, that's probably the best word for this book, the dhikr, the warning. When you look at its contents, you will notice that it has 86 surahs which are Meccan. According to tradition, they would have been revealed between 610 and 622, the first 12 years of Muhammad's ministry. They're the largest part of the Quran. You would think, until you look at it, and when you look at it, you will notice that they are the longest part of the Quran, and the reason why is simple, because those are the ones that are the shortest. So this book was really created by going from longest to shortest. And so if you just take the Quran and break it in half, around Surah 28, Surah 24, Surah 28, this first half, this goes from right to left because it follows the Arabic. This would be Medinan, this would be Mecca. Let's get it right about halfway. And the reason for that is that those are the 2 cities that the Quran supposedly was revealed to Muhammad. First in Mecca, which is the second half, and then in Medina, which is the first half. Goes kind of backwards, doesn't it? So just turn it upside down if you have a problem. And it's fascinating because there are some Meccan verses in here and there are some Medinan verses in here. So it's not exactly, it's a rule of thumb is probably the best way to say it. Nonetheless, you can notice that when you go from Medinan, which begins with, to Mecca, these are much longer surahs, huge. They get shorter and shorter as they go by here. And that's why there's 86 of those. And when you look at the others, there are only 28 of these. Can you then see that whoever wrote the Quran, whoever was the one that actually wrote it down or created or put it together, I believe was probably a committee, many different people, they became more verbose the longer they went, even though they're at the beginning. So it's not chronological. And that's probably an awful lot of the confusion. Muslims are confused, so are we. It's not like the Bible at all. That's why I love the Bible, because the Bible does go from Genesis right through chronologically and goes up to Malachi, which is the one that was finished. The last one that was the finish of all the Old Testament books, 400 BC. And then it jumps to the 1st century AD and starts with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the gospel accounts, and continues on right to Revelation, which would make sense to be the last. It is chronological. It follows a theme. It follows a chronological theme all the way through God's redemptive plan for mankind from the very beginning, when it all went wrong there in Genesis 3, all the way to the very end. And we're going to see the last times, the end times. Can you see there's a completely different genre? We're using a completely different genre of literature between the Bible and the Quran. When you look at the size of the Quran, well, it has 114 chapters. The full Quran has 114 chapters, 6,616 verses, wow, and about 77,943 words, which makes 338,606 letters. For those who like statistics, that just kind of boggles my mind. It's not really, it sounds huge, but really this book, the Quran, is no bigger than our New Testament. It's about the same size as our New Testament. It is not the size of our entire Bible. So it's a much smaller book. And that also suggests why so many people want to memorize it, because it's not that much to memorize today, albeit they only memorize the Hafs Quran. So fascinating, because Muhammad himself, according to tradition, was asked, he was asked over and over again by the Jews in Medina. He had moved to Medina in 622. And for the first 2 years, the Jews did not accept him as a prophet. This is all according to their tradition. It was obvious they could not accept him as a prophet. We'll get into that later on as we get into Muhammad. But what was fascinating is to prove he was a prophet, they asked him to do a miracle. And you see this, and I'll just refer, these are the references in the Quran where this comes up. In chapter 2, verse 118 to 119. In chapter 6, verse 37. Also verse 124. In chapter 13, verse 7. And more, probably the best place to go is in chapter 17, verse 59, and also verse 90 to 93. Over and over again, the Jews asked Muhammad to prove that he's a prophet. Just do a miracle. All the prophets did miracles. Or do a prophecy. He couldn't. And so what was his response? Look and see what his response was. Over and over again, he said, I am nothing more than a warner, I am a guide, and a bearer of glad tidings. When they confronted him on this, he said, listen, the prophets before did miracles and you killed them. I'm nothing more than a guide, a warner, a bearer of glad tidings. Not much of a response, not much of a defense. So, what then was Muhammad's miracle? Ask a Muslim that, and I ask you Muslims right now, so what was Muhammad's miracle? And you will say, this book. This is his miracle. That's what you tell me. And I've heard this for almost 40 years, that this is Muhammad's miracle. How could an illiterate man who could not read or write put together such a beautiful book? Well, this is one of the reasons we're doing this series, because I want to ask that question. First of all, in the first video I asked, is this the Word of God, the Word of God? Can it really ever qualify as the Word of God? And secondly, is this Muhammad's miracle? If this is such a great book, after this series, I want to come back to those two questions and ask you, who are watching this, is this really a miracle? We're going to find lots of problems with this book. And I hope by the end of this series, Muslims will stop saying that this is his one miracle. Looking at the historical critique, we know it did not come from Muhammad. But I'm going to ask you right now, looking internally, can you ever claim that this is Muhammad's miracle? God bless you. Great to have you. What a beautiful setting. Isn't this beautiful here? It gets even better as the leaves start to come as we move into the spring. Okay, this is Jay then. Over and out.